Good afternoon, hello and welcome to the Department of Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge in the UK. I'm Dr. Rhys Grant and I am the Science Communication Specialist here in the Biochemistry Department, shared also with the Cell and Molecular Biology programme at the Cancer Research UK Cambridge Centre at Cambridge University. So for this 2021 Cambridge Festival talk, I am joined by two fantastic speakers. So firstly, we have Dr. Paolo Bombelli, who is currently a visiting researcher in our department. And secondly, but no means least, we have Professor Christopher Howe, who is Professor of Plant and Microbial Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge in the UK. As always, I'm also joined by Latika Sugamba from our department secretariat team, and Latika is going to be helping me out behind the scenes with running this afternoon's events. So for this talk, Paolo is going to be speaking to us about how electricity is used to power plants and how we could harness this potential source of literal green electricity. But before we get on to that awesome topic, the first thing that I'd like to ask you all to please do is to click the subscribe button down below to follow our YouTube channel, because we have loads more talks coming up this week for the Cambridge Festival. And we're also planning on bringing you more live content direct from our department in the near future. I'd also like to encourage you all to please check out our other social media channels after the talk, obviously, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and so on, using our handle, which is @CamBiochem. So that's CAMBIOCHEM, because we use these channels to bring you all of the news, the research, the teaching, the outreach, and information on everything really that we do in our departments. I also just want to mention that after Paolo's talk this afternoon, Paolo, Chris, Latika, and myself will be having a live question and answer session. So if you have any questions on Paolo's talk, or even if you just want to ask us more general questions about the future of green electricity, if you could post these in the live chat on YouTube, and then we'll stay around for about 15 minutes after Paolo's talk to answer as many of your questions as we can get through. If you do choose to participate in the Q&A session, you don't have to worry about being seen or heard, because it will just be me reading your questions out for you anonymously. So before we get started, I just want to introduce you properly to Paolo. So as I mentioned, Paolo is currently a visiting researcher in our department, but he's also a research fellow in the Department of Science and Political Environment at the University of Milan in Italy. And Italy is actually where Paolo began his research career. So Paolo got his degree in plant biology from the Università Statale in Milan in Italy. And then he obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2012 for his work on the fundamental principles of photobioelectrochemistry, which is a term that I'm sure you'll be hearing more about in Paolo's talk this afternoon. Since Paolo obtained his PhD and did some postdoctoral work in our department, Paolo's gathered around him a team of collaborators from leading research groups, industrial partners, and non-profit organizations. And with them, by combining biology, materials science, and engineering, Paolo's long-term goal is to translate the principles of photobioelectrochemistry into practical applications. And it's because of this work that Paolo has the rather awesome title of being plant and algal electrician. I also just want to introduce you to Chris Howe, who, as I mentioned, is Professor of Plant and Microbial Biochemistry at the University of Cambridge. And Chris is going to be taking part in the Q&A session with us after Paolo's talk. So Chris has spent 40 years studying photosynthesis and how this process evolved. As well as researching how algae can produce electric currents that we can harness, Chris is also working on the evolution of photosynthesis in dinoflagellate algae. And these are the symbionts that power coral reefs, with coral bleaching being what happens when photosynthesis becomes unbalanced and this symbiosis breaks down. And if that's a topic that you'd like to hear more about, you should check out our talk from earlier this afternoon from Dr. Ross Waller on endosymbiosis and the cellular partnerships that are powering the planet. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Paolo for this afternoon's talk. So thank you very much, Paolo.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much, Reese, for your kind introduction. So today, what I like to take you through is something that might be a bit surprising, which for plants, to growing plants, electricity is actually quite important. Let's start with some generic concept about plants. So plants take energy from the sun, and they use it to combine it with carbon dioxide and water to grow and generate oxygen as a byproduct with the help of some minerals like nitrogen or phosphorus from the soil. This process, for some of you, might be already well known to be called photosynthesis. Point is, photosynthesis is actually driven by electricity. So what what do I mean with that? In order to define some common elements, let me try to tell you what electricity actually is. So we all have experience of electricity. So we are actually communicating each other today using devices that are powered by electricity. On the other hand, not necessarily we all know what electricity is. So electricity is made by electrons, and specifically electrons that move. In the same way that a river is made by drops of water that move. So in a certain way, we can actually say that electricity is a river of electrons. Just to give you an example, if you have a radio and you want to power the radio, you want to have some sound, some music from this radio, you need to channel this river of electrons through the radio. And by doing that, you transform some of the kinetic energy of the current and you generate the sound. So if we measure the flow of water, we can perhaps we can say how many drops per second. However, drops is a quite small unit. So instead we can say how many liters per second, or if we're talking about, for example, a big river, we can actually say cubic meter per second. In the same way, if we want to measure electricity, we can actually say how many electrons are moved per second. However, in the same way, electrons is very small. So instead of using electrons, we can say coulomb per second. A coulomb is actually quite a large number of electrons. So 1 coulomb is equal to 624 million of billions of electrons. Now, I know that this can be a bit confusing, but I also like to introduce another way to measure the electricity, which might be more familiar for some of you, which is the milliamp hour. So 1 milliamp hour is equal to 3.6 coulomb. If you remember, we just said that the coulomb is this astronomical large number of electrons. This might be more familiar with some of you because we all have at home some batteries. And for example, a classical AAA batteries carries about 1,000 milliamp of electric charges. Therefore, in one of these batteries, we have that number of electrons. I'm not even going to read it, but just to give you the feeling, the perception, how many electrons are actually stored in the AAA batteries. Now, let's go back to the plant. And as a first step, let's look inside the plant. So if with the microscope, we're gonna investigate the structure of the plants, we're gonna discover that plants are made by many cells. In the same way that human body is made by cell, also plants' body are made by cell. And if we look inside plant cell, we can see some compartments. The red one you can see up here is actually the nuclei. The turquoise one is a mitochondria. And also there is one that here is in green, which is called chloroplast. There is a very interesting fact about chloroplasts. Chloroplasts actually were free-living photosynthetic organisms, which have been taken up by non-photosynthetic cell about 1 billion years ago. And in this way, the modern plants has evolved. So if you want to know more about this, Dr. Ross Wallace actually gave a very nice talk few hours ago, which is still available on YouTube on this link. But let's go back to our discussion. So if we look inside the chloroplast, then we can see some membranes called thylacose membrane. And it's quite important be focused on this membrane, because it's on this membrane that photosynthesis actually take place. Two fundamental elements in this membrane are called photosystems. We have two photosystems which are being called, for convenience, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Photosystems are large multi-protein complex. They include a system for transporting electrons, redox couple, and pigments. They are so important, those pigments, because photosystems are like tiny solar panel. They harness light and they use it to do some job. Specifically, photosystem 2 is probably, I like to describe it as one of the most fantastic result of the natural evolution, because photosystem 2 is giving to any photosynthetic oxygenic organism something completely and totally unique. Photosystem 2 is giving to plants, cyanobacteria, algae, the possibility to generate electrons from water. So thanks to the photosystem 2, specifically the so-called oxygen evolving complex, the photosystem is able to harness light and use it for splitting water in oxygen, protons, and electrons. Therefore, water is consumed by the photosystem 2, oxygen is generated, and electrons are actually taken from water and move across the so-called electron transport chain. So in a way that this electron transport chain, which is made by several components, for example, plastoquinol, cytochrome, plastocyanin, they actually operate like an electrical wire. They do have additional function that we are not discussing today. For example, why electrons are moved through the electron transport chain, protons are also pumped, but we're not going to discuss this, the proton transport, why electrons are moved. What is important is those electrons are moved from the photosystem 2, where they are generated by splitting water, to the photosystem 1. And when they reach the photosystem 1, then they are used for producing other products, which then combine with carbon dioxide, CO2, and additional nutrients, nitrogen, phosphate. They permit the plant to grow. So overall, if we look inside the plant, we can actually see that the plant requires electricity, so this is a river of electrons to grow. The point here is how many electrons does a plant need to grow? I need to say that when I start preparing this material for this talk, this question was actually new for me as well, in the sense that I never really thought how many electrons are required to grow 1 gram of biomass of plant. So therefore, I decided to do some some calculation, and those calculations start from some basic consideration, which are the so-called stoichiometry, from which water is split in a proton, electrons, and oxygen. So to generate 12 oxygen, we need 6 molecules of water. Then 12 oxygen can be combined with 12 protons and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus several enzymes to generate glucose. And this is one of the first product of the Kelvin cycle, which is also called the dark reaction of the photosynthesis. Then from glucose, thanks to other enzymes, so a very complex metabolic steps, we can actually generate more complex sugars and carbohydrate, lipid, proteins, and whatever we need to build up a new biomass. So in order to calculate how many electrons we need to build up 1 gram of biomass, we have done some consideration and some calculation, and they are all presented in the next page of calculation, which will be available to be checked for you. But I'm not going to take you through all these consideration and calculation. So on this point, in this moment, you need to trust what I'm telling you. But based on this calculation, we work out that to generate 1 gram of biomass, dry biomass of plant, we need about 8,878 coulomb. If you remember before, we said that in the AAA batteries, there are 1,000 milliamp hour, which are equivalent to 3,600 coulombs. Therefore, as this is more than double to this value, the number of electrons required to build up 1 gram of biomass, plant biomass, are stored in equivalent of 2.5 AAA batteries. So I also now like to suggest to do a simple experiment where we can try to understand in a very visual and simple way this process of electron transport by measuring the rate of accumulation of biomass. So it's now springtime, the sun is out, you might have a garden and you might like to have a nice lawn of grass on your garden. So it might be easier for some of you to get some seed of grass. So get yourself also a pot, see some of your seed of grass, and then we need to wait a few weeks. I done this experiment myself not long ago. Grass is very fast to grow. Within 1 week, you're gonna have the first blades of grass coming out. And in 4 weeks, you have this pot of grass, nicely green, full. Don't forget to water your plants. Then you need to harvest both the blades and the root. When you harvest the root, please remember to remove the soil. Perhaps you want to wash them in water. Warm water is easier to remove the bits of soil from the roots. So we need to have a clean plant biomass. And then you need to have a scale to determine the mass. Before doing that, you need to dry your biomass. I did it in my oven. Actually, I done it while I was baking a cake. I also put my biomass inside. The biomass are the blades and the root of the plants. So in this way, I determined that in 4 weeks, the plants grew, generating about 2.74 grams of new plants. Then, if you remember, 1 gram was equivalent to 2.5 AAA batteries. Therefore, in this way, we can actually calculate that in 4 weeks, this plant is actually requiring to grow almost almost the electrons, the electron charge that are stored in seven AAA batteries, which in my view very quite something, thinking that in a few weeks all those electrons are actually used for growing a plant. So I hope that this is actually telling you that, is actually convincing you that electrons are essential for for plants to live and to grow. Therefore, we reach a point where if you think that there are so many electrons moving inside of a living plant and required to grow a plant, perhaps we can also start thinking that we can take some of these electrons out of the plants and use it for, I don't know, perhaps powering small electronic devices. So we actually did it. So in this picture, you can see an electrochemical system, bioelectrochemical system that we built up a few years ago. The electrochemical system is operating with MOS. And in this electrochemical system, the photosynthetic activity of MOS is used for generating organic substrates that will be released in a substrate where the soil is living. In this substrate, there are non-photosynthetic bacteria, which they are anyway important for the metabolic activity of the moss. And those bacteria are able to take up the metabolites released from the moss, oxidize those metabolites, generate protons and electrons, which are collected by the cathodic and the anodic ends of the electrochemical system. And this permitted to generate currents. And by doing that, we were able to power a radio for, I think for about a minute with some moss. If you check out this video, you can find more information about this experimental work. In the same way, we can actually generate electricity from algae. Specifically, I'm talking about microalgae. Microalgae are defined microalgae, microscopic algae, so algae so small that cannot be seen with naked eyes. Those ones that if you go in a pond and if you scoop the water and you see the water be greenish, you probably be sure that in that water there are some microalgae. If that is fresh water, my guess would be chlorella, but this is just my guess. So in some respect, microalgae are just tiny plants. And we can also generate electricity by building up an electrochemical system around these tiny plants called algae. In this example, we have actually generated electricity using, I believe this one was either chlorella or Synechococcus, which is technically not a green algae, but cyan bacteria, very much related in terms of photosynthesis, in terms of oxygen photosynthesis, and we were able to power a clock. I'm also leaving you some reference here, are scientific paper that you can check and find more information about this material. I try to giving you reference of scientific paper that are available online for free. So therefore, in principle, everyone can actually access this material. So in conclusion, photosynthesis uses tiny amount of electrical current powered by the sun. Electron taken from water, and when we're taking electron from water, we also generate as a byproduct oxygen, are transferred to carbon dioxide to make first sugar and then to permit the plant to grow. 1 gram, to build up 1 gram of plant, 1 gram dry matter, we need almost 2.5, the equivalent of 2.5 batteries, the charge in 2.5 batteries. And we can actually harness some of these electrical current, to power small electronic devices. With that, I really want to thanks all the people that share the lab with me in Chris in the house lab in Cambridge. I want to thank all the sponsors that permit us to work in this exciting project. And of course, I want to thank you for your attention, and hopefully you have questions, and we'll be very happy to ask. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Paolo. That was a really interesting talk. And just to clarify, did you say you did those calculations for working out the number of batteries to biomass ratio for this talk?
So I did myself. There are some assumptions. Therefore, when you build up biomass, you need to take into account whether this biomass is rich in sugar. For example, if you build up an orange, in an orange you have far more sugar compared like an olive or a pea. Olive will be more rich in lipid. A pea is going to be more rich in protein. So depending which kind of biomass, this calculation need to be rearranged. This calculation is a generic, taking account on the average amount of carbon that we might store in the biomass. But is there, we did this exercise in order to give an example, try to understand whether those currents are so tiny that cannot be compared with items that are common to everyone as a battery, or is comparable. And actually they're very much comparable.
So I was thinking, so are the people watching this are the first essentially to find out that 1 gram of grass biomass is the equivalent of 2.5 AAA batteries?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, we did this calculation. As I said, when I started calculation, was also for me a big question mark. I didn't know that the answer was, well, yeah, for 1 gram, we need just a tiny amount of the charge of a battery, or we need 100 batteries. So yeah, the results are completely new.
It's great. It's a really interesting way of sort of drawing the parallel to something from when we look at the electrons flowing, we can't really understand that. And then when you say it's the equivalent of 2.5 AAA batteries, it kind of puts it into perspective.
Reese, if you don't mind, I'd like to specify the fact that we're talking about the electrons charge stored in the batteries, not the electron motive force, in the sense that for a battery, the battery delivers electrons at a certain potential. So in this calculation, we took in account the charges, which are for a battery are electrons. If we need to take in account also the potential, the calculation will be a bit different, because we don't calculate anymore how many charges, but the energy, which is related to the charge, but also to the potential. I know this can be even more confusing, but I just want to specify this because the calculation is just based on charges and non potential.
Yeah. I forgot to say to everyone watching this that we are now having the Q&A session. I was too excited to ask that question because that's completely blown my mind. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Paolo, Chris, or even myself and Lautica, if you post these in the live chat on YouTube, and then we'll answer these for you. So yeah, get the questions in and we'll answer them. There is already a question actually. So you might need to explain this a bit, but it's are C4 plants like maize 33% better at powering electrical devices?
Chris, would you mind to step in on this?
Paolo's passing the difficult ones on to me. So to explain, C4 plants are they have a slightly different way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the enzyme that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is actually a pretty rubbish enzyme, because it has a tendency to take oxygen out of the atmosphere as well if it's not careful. And that's a bad thing, because that means that some of the energy that the plant has already stored gets lost. And C4 plants have a way of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's very clever and avoids that. And it's a way of doing it that's evolved a large number of different times independently. So yes, C4 plants are better at storing carbon dioxide. The actual machinery for turning sunlight into electrons or whatever is really very similar. So the difference is a little bit later down the machinery, as it were. So overall, C4 plants work better. They turn sunlight into electrical energy in the same way, so probably you're not going to be able to get any more electricity out of C4 plants than out of ordinary plants, but they're better at storing sugars and things that you can eat. Is that all right, Paolo?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I just want to stress something that you just said, on the fact that on the fundamental level, when it's a matter of generating electrons from water, what we call during the talk this photosystem 2 is actually very similar across the plant kingdom. So there are strong similarity in the structure of the photosystem 2 in plants, algae, macroalgae, microalgae, some bacteria. And in my view, when I start my work in a lab, I was very much intrigued by the photosystem 2. And I mean, in some respect, I remain intrigued by the photosystem 2. However, alone is actually not able to complete the job. So it's doing a fantastic job splitting water, but then those electrons need to be used. And then come to what Chris just said in terms of using those electrons for carbon organication, the C4, C3, CAM, and so on.
Yes, and whilst we're talking about photosynthesis then, and this might be a bit of a difficult question to answer in a short Q&A session, but how did photosynthesis evolve? Because that first step from being non-photosynthetic to being photosynthetic is quite a jump.
Again, I really think, Chris, this is yours.
I could see that coming, Paolo.
Yeah.
Photosynthesis evolved. There are different kinds of photosynthesis. So the photosynthesis that we're used to, that you find in green plants and algae and so on, produces oxygen. And that's what Paolo was talking about, thanks for this photosystem 2. Now, before that, there was a simpler form of photosynthesis that didn't actually produce oxygen. And we think that it's possible that the organisms that developed that kind of photosynthesis initially were not using sunlight, but were using energy from the gaps between continental plates on the Earth's surface as they pull apart, and you get these really hot liquids coming up from the underneath the Earth's surface. So the very earliest forms of photosynthesis might have been powered that way. And then there was this amazing transition, which was the ability to take electrons out of water in photosynthesis. And that was when photosynthesis really, if you like, took off. And that's what gave rise to all the oxygen in the atmosphere, which is a waste product from oxidation of water and so on. So the photosynthesis evolved from probably fairly simple systems that might have used heat energy or infrared radiation, something like that. And the real big step forward, which I always say is probably the most important event ever in the history of the planet, was this acquiring this ability to take electrons out of water and produces oxygen. And if it weren't for that, then we wouldn't exist, because there wouldn't be any oxygen in the planet. And that happened, we think, probably about 3.5 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago. There are arguments over exactly when it happened, but we think probably about 3 billion years ago and possibly a bit older. And that was what really kicked off, life on the planet, I think.
So there's a question for Paolo then. So we've got this fantastic process now in photosynthesis. How do you go from looking and studying photosynthesis to thinking, I'm going to try and plug my iPad into this houseplant? Where did that idea come from of using plants to power electrical devices?
Well, actually, so I still remember that I was undergrad in the University of Milan. And while I was studying for my biochemistry course, I was reading on my book about the so-called early stage of photosynthetic reaction. And those reactions are also called the so-called Hill reaction, after a scientist, Robin Hill, which actually was in Cambridge, pretty much and very much in the same department where we are now in biochemistry. And in this Hill reaction, they were stressing the fact that electrons were flowing from photosystems to electron carriers that are artificial electron carriers. And at that time, for a completely different reason, I had a minimum amount of knowledge in electricity. And these started bugging me on the level that, so if if you can really describe those electrons coming out from the photosynthetic apparatus as a flow of electrons, this means that is electricity. So, and then from that point onward, I've start get involved in the possibility to generate electricity from a living organism, specifically photosynthetic. And that was pretty much the starting point of my interest. What makes things even more, say, intriguing is the fact that when I joined the lab about 10 years ago, perhaps about 10 years ago, I had the incredible pleasure to meet Derek Bendel, that at that time he was, as a retired academic person, he was helping us in the lab. And Derek Bendel actually was a PhD student with Robin Hill. So I found so gifted to have this connection with people that, and Derek Bendel himself did so much to study the electron transporting plant. But all started with these people describing in my book those electrons coming out as a flow of electrons.
It is amazing to think that one day we could just be able to plug our mobile phone chargers into our, assuming your houseplants are alive. I mean, mine aren't, so I'm not going to be able to charge my phone with them. But if you can keep houseplants alive, like Vatica behind her in the reception, that you could power electrical devices with them, it's very science fiction, very futuristic.
I'm shocked that you don't have real houseplants, though, Reese.
I do. They're not the happiest houseplants in the world. They're a Christmas tree left over from Christmas, but it's, I think, dying.
It looks mostly alive, so yeah, kudos for that.
There are some amazing ways that other organisms in the environment can harvest differences in electrical properties. So if you look in sediments at the bottom of the sea, then depending on how deep you go in the sediments, just a few millimeters or a few centimeters down, there are differences in the electrical properties in those layers of sediments. And there are bacteria called cable bacteria. And those cable bacteria form little filaments, and they link different layers of sediments. And that causes current to flow through the cable bacteria as they link the different layers of sediment. And they can use that current to power some of the processes in the bacteria.
Oh, wow.
So I think that's just such a spectacular way in which organisms have been able to find other ways of, setting up these little electric currents that are able to power cells. So in theory, you might connect your iPad up to your houseplants, or you might take your iPad to the seaside with a couple of electrodes and jab them into the sand at the right level and get some current out of it. You can get a lot of current, but you can get a bit of current out of it that way.
And speaking about powering things, and someone's put in the chat, so in a Science on Sunday session at the Cambridge Botanic Garden, Chris, apparently you showed a clock that was grass powered. Someone's asking, is that clock still running? Or does the grass have to be changed in intervals like a battery?
So I'm going to hand the question back to Paolo, because that was actually one of Paolo's experiments that we showed. I remember talking in the Science on Sunday, but I'll hand that over to Paolo, and he can talk about some of the things that devices he's been able to run.
So let me first try to answer whether the grass need to be changed, or the photosynthetic organisms, generally speaking, need to be changed. So the answer is, well, we are doing our best to give a negative answer. So we like to say, no, we don't need to change it. What we need to do, we need to keep it alive. So in principle, our effort is to be able to generate a constant stream of electrons coming out from the metabolic activity, both photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic. And we want to achieve that by keep the plant alive. So in principle, by watering the plant, by keep the plants under the right condition of temperature and light, we can have a system that operates, well, I don't like to say forever, because I don't think it's a very much scientific term, but for a very long time. In the same way that the plants probably will not live forever, but could live for several years. That would be a target that we want to achieve. In terms of what we can power, we are now running some system which are actually operating for several months, where we actually power a tiny computer, something that people know as a CPU, with a system working with algae. So I need to admit that we are not yet able to power a large appliance, large devices, and maybe not necessarily this will be the target for this technology. However, if you think to be in a situation where electricity is not available, for example, you are living somewhere off grid on a very remote area, having a way to power your radio, your mobile phone, a small light in the night could really change the quality of life, the quality of your life. Therefore, this technology might be targeted for this specific situation where the national grid is not available, and developing a national grid will be such an investment in terms of energy and money, which make more sense having a localized source of energy.
Well, thank you. Latika, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
Again, I'm always here with the silly ones.
There are no silly questions. No stupid
Well,
questions. People probably thought Paolo was stupid when he first thought, I'm going to plug an electrical device into my houseplant. So there are no stupid questions.
Well, I think it's sort of one of those, it'd make a really cool backstory for like a comic book. So, the scientist who generates electricity from plants. And I was thinking, if he had a superhero name, what would it be? So there's the question.
I'm definitely handing that one over to Paolo.
Thank you, but Chris, you might regret this, because a few years ago for Christmas, we create a superhero which is flying around in his green costume. I think it's called Alga Man, and he has a charming face of Chris.
Okay, that's amazing.
And I believe, Chris, you have Algaman near your in your office, near your desk.
I have the Algae Man picture up in my office, indeed. Yeah.
I'll be checking that out soon, I'm sure. I mean, I also came up with a sort of dynamic duo name for you guys, which would be Chris Howe and the Pal. So, you know.
Very good. When I was Dr. Howe, before I became professor, I always used to get people joking about Doctor Who and Dr. Howe.
Amazing.
We need to get Paolo to change his name.
I think having the title of plant and algal electrician is a pretty awesome job title, or unofficial job title.
Well, I'm actually very proud of that. And I recently considered that maybe I should also have an algae plant plumber, in the sense that for 50% of my time in doing experiment is actually dedicated to fix water leaking. So the system that we create, they require water, because plants and algae, they do require water. And unfortunately, quite frequently, we have a water leak. So I find myself being an electrician, but sometimes a plumber as well. So
this a whole new field of utilities that are being opened up by your research.
There are bacteria. I talked about the cable bacteria. There are other bacteria that live by transferring electrons into the outside environment, and they do it for various reasons. One is to help them to get hold of minerals in the environment, and they have almost like little wires that come out of their cells, tiny little conductive filaments. We sometimes call them nanowires, and they really are like little wires about a micrometer or so long that can transfer electrons into the outside world. So you know, there really are quite strong analogies really between electricians wiring up things at large scale and home, and bacteria wiring into the environment and transmitting electrons into the world around them. It's really quite striking what they can do.
Are there any that make plumbing pipes to assist with Paolo's plumbing problems?
I'm not sure. I'll think about that one.
Well, we can look into this.
I guess one final question to just before we wrap up is, in the ideal world, how long or how far away into the future do you think it will be before we have electrical devices in our homes, or indeed in the remote locations like you suggested, that we can power with plants? So how far away is this technology?
Paolo, I'll let you answer that.
Thank you. So sometimes there is a tricky way to answer this question, and we can say 5 years, because 5 years is an amount of time that is not too short, but is long enough to push it a bit. Therefore, I could actually use this safe way to answer the question. On the other hand, I'm also confident, and somehow I really think that we are not far from proving that we can use this technology for real world application, based on the assumption that what we power are small electronic devices. Based on the assumption that there is an increasing demand for powering small electronic devices in either remote location or off-grid. Therefore, for this specific type of application, I really believe that we are not far away. And I also believe that we might be able to see some of those plant power or algae power devices around within 5 years. That is let's say my hope.
2027-ish.
We have it in the diary.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that is the tricky. I'm pretty sure someone will say, "Oh, you said that."
Well, we
fair enough. Fair enough. Now I can see the clock is ticking.
The plant-powered clock, obviously.
Indeed.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I was thinking that the best way to answer your question would be, actually, my computer is now powered by plants. Unfortunately, it's not yet.
One day. Cool. I think it's time to wrap up this session. So I want to say thank you very much, Paolo, for a fascinating talk and for doing brand new calculations just for this session. That was great and very interesting. Thank you also, Chris, for joining us for the Q&A session. Thank you, Latika, for helping me out behind the scenes again. And thank you very much to everyone at home who's been watching our talk this afternoon. So we hopefully will see you again soon later this week, because we've got loads more talks coming up. So stay safe, have a lovely evening, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.